Kia ora koutou katoa, it's Mrs. Goodson here. This video is about a really important part of writing your science investigation report. It's about writing an evaluation. So, what is an evaluation? It is used to justify or give the reasons for the choices made in the investigation by evaluating the validity of the method and the reliability of the data. So the validity is all about the accuracy of the measurements, how at least two variables were controlled, and explains fully what would happen if those two variables were not controlled. What would happen? And it talks about how you could make your investigation better. So we need some definitions. Reliable. What makes data reliable? That means, can it be trusted? And this is achieved by repeating the experiment several times and thinking about, would someone else get the same result on a different day? So that's the reliability of our, and think about, is our investigation reliable? Is it accurate? This is all about measurements. Anytime you've got to take a measurement, you think, are the measurements taken as close to the true value as possible? And what equipment can we use? So can we use a measuring cylinder is more accurate than a beaker, for example, or just a guess in a jar. So we can improve the accuracy by the equipment we use and then techniques we use to use that equipment. And is our investigation valid? Validity is about whether or not your experiment actually addresses the question being asked. Could the trend observed be the result of some other factor? So your experiment is more likely to be valid if you control the key factors or these control variables. You need to be careful about the dependent variable you're measuring. It must be an accurate reflection of what you're trying to find out. So validity is all about controlling those control variables and only changing one thing so that it's a fair test. Is the investigation valid? If these other factors that might influence the outcome are not controlled, they may have an effect on the outcome. This means that any measured effect on the outcome could be the result of one of these other factors, rather than the factor that that's being assessed, the one you're trying to find out about. So the results of your investigation would be invalid. So this is if you didn't control the other factors. Now, let's think about a couple of examples. So, if you're doing the respiration investigation and the person's heart rate does not return to resting heart rate after each trial, then it would not be valid to compare the results of each trial, as the starting heart rate would be different for each trial. So that might affect the validity of your investigation. Another example is the intensity of the exercise. So if you choose to do, or if you're guided to do the duration of exercise, but the intensity exercise is meant to be, something you control, the person needs to do the exercise at the same intensity. And then sometimes in some of the trials, they do faster star jumps and others they do slower ones. So you have to think about how would that affect the results? And how could you control the intensity of the exercise so that it's the same? So you only want to change one thing and make it a fair test. If the method of the investigation does not control these factors that affect the results, then it is not a fair test and the results can't be relied on, and we say the conclusion is not valid. Another thing we have to think about, and this particularly applies in biology investigations, is a sample bias. So, a population is a certain animal or plant or other living thing that lives in a certain area. So, we've got the whole population that we might be trying to find out something about, but it's just not practical to do a census. And a census is when we talk to everybody. We do our investigation on the whole population. So instead of that, we take a small sample and we ask them our questions or measurements, and we assume that if the sample is representative, we assume that if we've chosen the sample carefully, the sample is representative of the whole population. So in our investigation for Biology 1.1, we just take one person. We just take a sample size of one person. And we are assuming that the results from that one person is representative of all humans. So, is that a valid assumption? Did you randomly select this person from the population of all humans? Or was there some sort of bias? Was there some sort of influence on how you chose it? And what criteria did you use? How could we reduce sample bias? And does it matter? Is it a valid assumption to make? Is it okay to make this assumption? What do you think? So, what should be in the evaluation? So, you're going to write a few paragraphs, a couple of 2 or 3 paragraphs to explain whether the design of the investigation is valid, reliable, and the results are accurate. So, you need to be able to justify, give the reasons of the choices that you made in the design of your investigation, and describe how you made sure your results are reliable and that you have enough data to enable you to determine any trend or pattern or a lack of one. In your evaluation, you're going to discuss how to overcome limitations and possible sources of error. And did your investigation produce results that can be trusted? How did you deal with outliers? So outliers are bits of data that just really don't fit. And usually you would repeat, if you've got time, repeat the trial and see whether you get the same result or you just leave it out of your average. Okay. How did you choose your sample? Was there a bias? Was the sample size big enough? How did you make your measurements accurate? Is there something you could have done to next time to improve the investigation? So, checklist for evaluation. At least 2 paragraphs that justify or give the reasons for the choices made in the investigation by explaining the validity. Was it a fair test? And the reliability of the data. Is the data trustworthy? You need to discuss how accuracy of measurements were ensured. How at least two variables, probably more. You're talking about the things you controlled. What would happen if these variables were not controlled? Really, what would have happened? And discuss the sample size and possible bias. Explain the reliability of the data. Identify any sources of errors or outliers and what decisions were made for improving reliability and why. So, this video has been all about writing an evaluation for a science investigation that justifies that the method and the results of the investigation are valid, accurate, and reliable.